I had to read the fine twice, then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from too much sun and not enough coffee. There it was, taped to the old wooden fence that had stood on my family's land for over a century. A bright orange violation notice. In bold, aggressive font, it read, "Unauthorized Land Usage, immediate fine, $500. I actually laughed out loud. My family owned this land. I was standing on Carter soil. But the laugh died in my throat when two shiny HOA security vehicles pulled up at the end of my driveway. They were serious, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. I grew up on this land. Every inch of it holds a memory. The old oak tree by the pond where I carved my initials as a kid. The worn path that winds through the fields where I used to race my brother on rusted-out bikes. And the old barn that still creaks in the wind like it's sharing an inside joke. My great-grandfather built the farmhouse with his own hands back in 1875, and not a day goes by that I don't think about the sweat and stubbornness it took to keep it standing through floods, droughts, and hard winters. Carter land isn't just property, it's legacy, it's history, it's home. So, when I got back from City Hall that afternoon and found that bright orange HOA notice flapping in the breeze on my fence, I almost didn't take it seriously. After all, we weren't part of the Willow Creek development, never had been, never would be. Our land wasn't inside their neatly planned rows of identical beige houses with their perfectly trimmed hedges and color-coordinated mailboxes. We sat just outside their boundary, where zoning laws were older than anyone on their precious HOA board. But apparently, none of that mattered to Karen Whitmore. Karen had been HOA president for about 6 months, but it only took 6 weeks for everyone to figure out she was on a power trip. She had already fined the Hendersons for having excessively bright garden gnomes and ordered the Patels to repaint their shutters because sage green wasn't an approved color. And now she was eyeballing my land like it was some kind of personal challenge. I'd heard the rumors. Karen wanted to expand the HOA's protection to include surrounding properties. Her words, not mine. Protection. Like we needed saving from ourselves. I shook my head and stuffed the notice into the glove compartment of my truck, right next to the permits and deeds that said in no uncertain terms, this land belonged to me. Not the HOA, not Karen. But when I glanced toward the road and saw her standing there in her designer sunglasses, arms crossed, staring at my fields like she already owned them, I knew this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. She wasn't going to back off, not until someone made her. Karen Whitmore moved into Willow Creek Estates like a summer storm, loud, sudden, and leaving a mess in her wake. Her house, or rather her executive residence, as she liked to call it, was a sterile slab of gray and glass perched right at the edge of town where our quiet countryside began. It didn't take long for her to start throwing her weight around either. First, it was the HOA newsletters, typed up like they were government decrees. Then came the endless inspections, as if she was personally responsible for keeping the neighborhood from falling into chaos. And now it was my land she had set her sights on. I didn't think much of her at first. To me, Karen was just another big fish who'd swum into a small pond, and didn't realize how deep the water really was. She strutted around in her pencil skirts and stiletto heels, like she was running for office, which was funny considering I was the one who actually held it. But Karen wasn't content with her HOA fiefdom of beige houses and regulation mailboxes. No, she had bigger plans. And they didn't include a centuries-old family farm messing up her view. Word around town was that Karen had been hosting vision board nights for the HOA members. She'd lay out her master plan in glossy color printouts, an expanded community, new developments, parks, and a modernized aesthetic that conveniently erased everything that made Willow Creek charming in the first place. The problem was, my land sat right in the middle of her fantasy. She called it an eyesore during one of her speeches at an HOA meeting, claiming the old barns and weathered fences were out of alignment with the neighborhood character. I overheard that little gem from Mrs. Patterson at the hardware store. She said Karen practically sneered when she mentioned it, like my family's farm was some dilapidated shack lowering property values. Karen had plans for my land. She wanted walking trails, maybe a community garden, even floated the idea of a clubhouse. And she wasn't interested in negotiating. She was just going to take it. What Karen didn't seem to grasp was that this wasn't some HOA playground she could bully her way through. This was Carter land, and I wasn't planning on giving up so easily. It started with the fencing, a bright orange notice nailed right to the post at the front gate, bold black letters screaming, "Unpermitted structure, subject to immediate removal." I stood there for a long minute, staring at it like it might make sense if I squinted hard enough. The fence in question had been there longer than the state highway. My grandfather and great-uncle built it together, hauling those thick wooden beams by hand, back when horses outnumbered cars in this county. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy, and it sure as hell wasn't illegal. The next notice came a few days later. This one was about the sheep. Karen claimed they were unauthorized livestock, a violation of some zoning ordinance she was suddenly enforcing like a tin pot dictator. I had 10 heritage sheep, all purebred Gulf Coast natives, grazing peacefully on our land like they had for the past 20 years. Their ancestors had survived hurricanes and droughts, but apparently they were now a menace to the carefully curated image of Willow Creek Estates. I found the citation flapping in the wind on my barn door one morning while I was tossing out feed. According to Karen, I had 7 days to rehome them, or face daily fines of $200. I folded the notice neatly and stuck it in the same folder I'd started after the first ridiculous claim. By the end of that week, I'd added 3 more, one about a broken wagon wheel Karen insisted was abandoned equipment, another claiming my tractor created an unsightly visual obstruction, and a personal favorite about excessive noise pollution from the wind chimes on my porch. I didn't say a word to her, not yet, but I started documenting everything, every notice, every photo she snapped from her SUV parked across the road, every so-called inspection where her little HOA security team would walk my fence line with clipboards, pretending they had any kind of authority. I kept meticulous notes, saved every piece of paper, and made sure my security cameras caught them every time they stepped 1 inch over the property line. I knew a bluff when I saw one. Karen was playing a game, pushing boundaries, seeing how far she could go before I pushed back, and I could wait, let her think she was winning. For now. It was a Tuesday evening when I got the call. Hank Peterson, who runs the feed store in town and always knows when something's going sideways, rang me up just as I was settling in with a cup of coffee on the porch. He sounded winded, like he jogged all the way from Willow Creek Estates to my front door. "Alex," he said, his voice low, like he was sharing a secret. "You better get down to the community center. Karen's pulling something, and it smells bad." I didn't waste time asking questions. 10 minutes later, I was standing in the back of the HOA's meeting room, arms crossed, watching the circus unfold. Karen was front and center, flanked by her usual band of clipboard carriers. The air smelled like cheap coffee and overconfidence. She was holding court like a queen addressing her subjects, flipping through a glossy slideshow on the big screen. Most of the seats were filled with HOA loyalists, folks who nodded at everything she said as if they were auditioning for a toothpaste commercial. "Annexation," Karen said, her tone all business, but there was a gleam in her eye that made my stomach twist. "It's the logical next step in maintaining Willow Creek's property values and community standards. We cannot allow unregulated properties to degrade our neighborhood aesthetic." I clenched my jaw. My property wasn't even in their jurisdiction. I'd checked the maps, the deeds, the zoning lines. The Carter land was outside the HOA's boundaries, had always been. But Karen wasn't one to let facts get in her way. They voted right then and there, no notice, no letters, no hearing, just a smug raise of hands from a room full of people who had no business deciding anything about my land. "The motion passes," Karen announced with a satisfied smile, banging her little sparkly gavel like she was running a courtroom instead of a kangaroo court. Hank found me after, his face pale beneath his ball cap. "She's serious, Alex," he muttered. "Talking about putting up new signs, rewriting bylaws. She's already got a contractor lined up for some kind of survey next week." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. It was escalating, all right, and Karen had no idea the kind of storm she was inviting, but she'd find out soon enough. The first sign went up sometime between midnight and dawn. I found it when I was doing my morning rounds, walking the fence line with a thermos of black coffee in one hand and my old shepherd dog trotting beside me. It was staked right into the ground at the edge of the south pasture, just beyond the barn, a gleaming white rectangle with bold, blocky letters. Willow Creek Estates Common Space, Private HOA Property. Below it, In smaller print, it said, "Access restricted to HOA members and guests." I stared at it for a full minute, steam curling from my cup, heart pounding louder than I cared to admit. My land, my family's land. And there it was, some cheap sign making it seem like I was the trespasser. Gus, my dog, sniffed it and gave a low growl, which I took as agreement. By lunchtime, there were 3 more signs, one by the orchard, one near the pond, and another along the gravel driveway. They didn't stop at signs either. Karen had sent over a crew in neon yellow vests to install what looked like security cameras on posts at regular intervals, all pointing toward my fields. Cheap plastic domes, but it was the principle. She wanted the neighbors to think I was under surveillance, that she had control. I caught one of her so-called security guys walking a little too close to the tool shed around 2 in the afternoon, clipboard in hand, snapping pictures with a phone like he was cataloging evidence. I leaned on the fence and waited until he noticed me. Took him a while. When he finally turned, I gave him a polite nod and tapped the badge clipped to my belt. Not the mayor's badge, but the county inspector's ID I still carried. He froze, stammered something about routine monitoring, and shuffled back toward his pickup so fast he nearly tripped over his own boots. By sundown, I'd found 6 of those fake cameras, most held up with cheap duct tape. A joke, really, but it wasn't funny. This wasn't petty anymore. Karen was playing the long game, trying to rewrite the truth, inch by inch, post by post. What she didn't understand was that I was documenting everything too, and I wasn't about to let her redraw my boundaries without a fight. It didn't take long for the rumors to start swirling. First, it was the usual coffee shop chatter, folks swapping stories over burnt diner brew and day-old muffins. But then I started hearing it from people who didn't usually stick their noses in HOA business, people who cared more about the Friday night football game than what color someone's shutters were painted. That's when I knew something was brewing. According to the latest gossip, Karen was planning to break ground on a brand new Willow Creek Estates clubhouse. Not in their subdivision, though, right smack in the middle of my pasture. They said it was going to have a fitness center, a pool, maybe even a fancy little wine bar where the HOA board could toast themselves for a job well done. And a parking lot. Always a parking lot. Because what better way to pave over history than with a few 100 yards of fresh asphalt? At first I thought it was just more talk. Karen was bold, sure, but she wasn't stupid enough to think she could get away with building on land she didn't own. Then Hank Peterson called again, his voice tight. "You need to get down to city records," he said. "Something's fishy." He wasn't wrong. The permits had been filed last week. There were blueprints, stamped and signed. The site map had my property outlined in red ink, labeled Phase 1 Development. According to the paperwork, I'd given consent for the entire project, signature and all. The thing is, I hadn't signed a damn thing. I stared at the shaky scrawl they tried to pass off as mine, feeling the kind of cold that starts in your gut and works its way out. They'd forged my name. Sloppy, but just neat enough to fool someone who wasn't looking too close. The notary stamp was bogus, too. I recognized the name, but it belonged to a guy who'd moved out of state years ago. I made copies of everything, hard copies, digital files, backups on a flash drive that I slipped into my back pocket. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was fraud. And if Karen thought this little paper trail was going to stand up when I was through with it, she had another thing coming. By the end of the week, you could feel it in the air, like a storm coming over the hills, thick and charged. Half the town was talking about Karen's so-called community improvement plan, parroting her buzzwords like they were gospel. Property values, they said. Modernization, they said. Like they'd all read from the same pamphlet, probably one of those glossy handouts Karen had stuffed in their mailboxes between HOA violation notices. I heard it everywhere. At the grocery store, while picking up a sack of feed. In line at the bank, while waiting behind old Mr. Harris, who kept muttering something about a clubhouse being good for business. Even at church, where the potluck table suddenly felt like a war zone. Folks who used to swap recipes were now arguing over whether a wine bar and a yoga studio were worth paving over history. Karen wasn't stupid. She knew exactly how to play to people's wallets. She promised better amenities, higher home values, more buyers flocking to Willow Creek. She painted a picture of a future where the whole town would be upscale, pristine, and well-to-do. For some folks, that was enough. They didn't care about the old Carter place or the history tied up in those fence posts. They cared about the zeros on their property appraisals. But not everyone was buying what she was selling. There were plenty who saw right through her. People like Hank Peterson, who knew what it meant to fight for something real, like Eleanor James, whose great-granddaddy had carved his initials into the same oak tree mine had. They understood that our town's soul wasn't something you could slap a price tag on. They came out to the farm, quiet at first, then louder as more joined, offering help, advice, or just a steady presence. One afternoon, I found Eleanor sitting on my front porch with a pitcher of sweet tea and a look that said she was staying put, whether I liked it or not. She told me folks were organizing, talking about holding their own meetings, making signs, drafting petitions, a proper old-school grassroots movement. Still, the divide was there. You could see it in the way people crossed the street to avoid each other, in the cold nods that replaced warm greetings. Karen had drawn a line in the dirt, and the whole town was choosing sides. I heard them before I saw them. The deep, low rumble of diesel engines cutting through the early morning, quiet like a warning. I was standing on the front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun creep up over the fields when the first bulldozer came into view. It trundled down the narrow road like it owned the place, followed by two more, each trailing dust clouds in their wake. They rolled right up to the edge of my property like they had every right to be there, their operators sitting high in their cabs, helmets gleaming in the pale light. Karen showed up 5 minutes later. Of course she did, wearing another one of her crisp white pantsuits like she was ready for a photo op. She stood at the front of the convoy, arms folded, sunglasses reflecting the morning sky, pretending she wasn't completely out of her depth. When she finally spoke, it was in that chipper, fake polite voice she always used when she thought she was in control. "Mr. Carter," she said, smiling like this was some neighborly errand. "We're here to clear the debris along the common space boundary. You've been given notice." I took a slow sip of my coffee, just to give myself a second. "This isn't common space," I said, keeping my voice level. "And you're about 5 feet over the line." She waved her clipboard at me like it was a holy relic. "The board voted. We have authority." "No," I said, setting my mug down on the porch rail. "You don't." That's when my deputies pulled up. 2 marked cruisers, lights flashing, sirens silent. Deputy Morales got out first, hand resting on his belt, nodding at me like we were just here for a Sunday chat. Deputy Harper followed, clipboard in hand, but his wasn't full of phony HOA notices. It was the real paperwork, the legal documents that said exactly where my land started and ended. Karen's smile faltered when Morales approached the lead bulldozer, tapping on the window and telling the operator to shut it down. "You're trespassing," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And if you fire up this engine again, we'll have to impound the equipment." The operators didn't argue. They killed the engines, climbed down, and stood there looking uncomfortable. Karen tried to protest, but the words tangled up in her throat. This wasn't one of her meetings. This wasn't her turf. It was mine. By noon, word had spread like wildfire. Half the town was already buzzing about the showdown at my property line, and I figured it was time to settle things out in the open. No more whispers. No more backdoor meetings. I called a press conference on the front steps of City Hall. It wasn't my favorite way to spend an afternoon, but some fights need a crowd. I stood there in my boots and work shirt, dust still clinging to my sleeves from that morning, while reporters from the local paper and a couple of regional news stations set up their cameras. I spotted Karen pacing by the fountain across the street, frantically punching something into her phone. She looked about as comfortable as a cat in a rainstorm. Her usual army of clipboard carriers hovered nearby, waiting for orders. None came. When the mics were live and the cameras rolling, I kept it simple. "As mayor," I said, my voice carrying across the square, "it's my responsibility to ensure this town respects its history, its laws, and its people." I paused just long enough to let that hang in the air. My family has owned and cared for this land for over 150 years. We have the deeds, we have the permits, and we have state historical protections in place that make any unauthorized development not only illegal, but punishable by federal fines. The crowd murmured. Some of the HOA loyalists shifted uncomfortably. A few even started edging toward the back. I held up a folder, thick with paperwork, flipping through pages as I spoke. These documents prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this land is privately owned, properly zoned, and protected under state and federal law. Any action taken against it without my express permission is trespassing. Period. someone from the crowd shouted, "What about Karen?" And that's when I smiled. I turned slightly, giving the cameras a clear view as I pointed toward her. Mrs. Whitmore and her board knowingly filed fraudulent permits and forged my signature on legal documents. That's already under investigation. The camera crew from Channel 7 caught the moment Karen's jaw dropped, her face draining to a shade somewhere between pale gray and pure panic. Later that night, someone screenshotted the exact frame and slapped the caption, "When you realize the mayor owns your soul," underneath. It was an instant meme, viral by sunrise. Couldn't have happened to a nicer person. I called the emergency town hall for Friday night. Figured if I was going to drag this fight into the open, I might as well make it prime time. The meeting room at the community center filled up fast. By 7 o'clock, there wasn't an empty chair in sight. Folks stood along the walls, arms crossed, whispering to their neighbors. Some of them were Karen's biggest supporters a week ago. Tonight, they looked like they were waiting to watch her walk the plank. Karen showed up late, of course. She swept in with 2 of her board members, flanking her like bodyguards. Her smile was tight, like she'd practiced it in the mirror and wasn't sure it was holding. She nodded at a few people as she passed, but no one nodded back. She sat near the front, crossed her legs, and folded her hands over that ever-present clipboard like she was expecting an award. I started the meeting the way I always did, clear, steady, no grandstanding. "Thanks for coming," I said, stepping up to the podium. "We've got some serious matters to discuss." I clicked the remote, and the projector lit up the front wall with a document. One of the forged permits Karen had filed with the county office. Her name was right there, her signature bold as brass, right next to a notary seal that had expired 5 years ago. A low rumble ran through the room. Over the next 30 minutes, I laid it all out. Fraudulent applications, forged signatures, records of fines that were never approved by the board, and money that was never deposited where it was supposed to go. Harassment complaints, complete with dates, times, and witnesses. Photos of Karen's so-called security team, trespassing on private property and threatening homeowners with fake citations. I flipped through them one by one like I was reading a bedtime story. By the time I was done, the room was buzzing. People who had once kept quiet were raising their hands, shouting over each other. I heard Mrs. Patterson from the hardware store call Karen a snake. Hank Peterson shook his head and said, "Knew it," under his breath. Even some of Karen's former allies shifted their chairs away from her. Karen tried to speak, but no one was listening anymore. They were done with her, and she knew it. By the time I called for quiet, the room was already crackling with tension. Folks were on their feet, waving papers, demanding answers that Karen wasn't about to give. I let the noise settle on its own. No use shouting over folks when they're good and mad. When things finally quieted down to a low murmur, I clicked to the next slide on the screen. This was where things got serious. "What you've seen so far," I said, my voice steady, "is bad enough. Fraud, harassment, misuse of HOA funds. But there's more. And it's not just against me." I flipped to a photo of the South Pasture, the same one Karen had staked those bogus signs into, and then to a copy of the State Registry for Historic Properties. "This land," I said, tapping the screen, "is protected under state law as a historical site. It's been registered for over 50 years. That means any attempt to modify, build on, or develop this property without approval from the State Preservation Office is a felony." A few folks gasped. Karen's face was pale enough to make me wonder if she was still breathing. I gave her a moment to process that before I moved on. "And it doesn't stop there," I continued. "Karen's actions didn't just violate property law. They violated the Americans with Disabilities Act." I clicked to a photo of Eleanor James's house, the one Karen's security patrol blocked in for 3 days straight because Eleanor refused to cut down her heirloom roses. Targeting elderly and disabled residents, limiting their access to public and private spaces, that's an ADA violation, and those carry stiff penalties. You could feel the shift in the room. Anger settled into something quieter but sharper, a kind of grim understanding. Karen wasn't just a bully with a clipboard. She was facing serious legal consequences. I laid out the next steps like I was going over a dinner menu. The state attorney's office has been notified. Federal investigators are reviewing the evidence, and there will be formal charges. Karen's mouth opened like she was going to argue, but nothing came out. Her board members looked at her, then at the exit. One of them quietly slipped out the back. By the time I wrapped things up, it was clear. Karen wasn't just out of power, she was out of options. The official vote to remove Karen as HOA president happened the following week, but honestly, it was just a formality. By then, the decision had already been made in living rooms, on front porches, and around kitchen tables all over Willow Creek. Folks who'd once nodded politely at Karen during HOA meetings now crossed the street to avoid her. Even her closest allies had gone quiet, suddenly busy with other things when her name came up. The meeting was held in the same community center where she'd once strutted around like she owned the place. This time, she showed up alone. No entourage, no clipboard, no sparkle in her step. She sat in the back corner, sunglasses on, like they might shield her from the stares. They didn't. Hank Peterson called the meeting to order. He didn't waste time. "First motion," he said, clearing his throat, "removal of Karen Whitmore as president of the Willow Creek HOA." He barely got the words out before hands shot up across the room. People didn't just vote, they practically raced to second and third the motion. When it was done, Hank looked over at Karen. "You can stay to hear the rest," he said, polite as always, "or you can go." She didn't answer, just stood up slow, like gravity was working harder on her than the rest of us, and walked out without a word. The fallout hit fast. The state attorney's office confirmed they had launched an official investigation. Fraud, forgery, harassment, ADA violations, you name it, they were looking into it. Word spread that Karen's personal finances were under review too. Some folks said she tried to sell her house, but no one wanted to buy it, not with reporters parked out front and legal papers taped to the door. It wasn't long before the HOA passed a bylaw banning anyone under criminal investigation from holding office. Karen's name was on it in big, bold letters. She was done in Willow Creek, and from what I heard, she wouldn't be running an HOA, or anything else, anytime soon. I watched it all unfold quietly. I didn't need to say much. Karen had done all the talking for years. Now folks were finally listening to the truth, and the silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd heard in a long time. The next few weeks were a whirlwind, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like things were moving in the right direction. Folks who had avoided HOA meetings like the plague started showing up, pulling chairs closer, rolling up their sleeves, and asking real questions. You could tell they weren't there just to complain anymore. They wanted to fix what had been broken. Hank Peterson and I sat at his kitchen table one Saturday, papers spread out between coffee mugs and a plate of cold biscuits. We hashed out the first draft of the new bylaws right there, scribbling notes in the margins and crossing out anything that smelled like overreach. By the time we were finished, there was no room for anyone to pull a Karen again. We limited the HOA's power to what it was supposed to be, keeping the neighborhood in shape, not controlling people's lives. No more fines without a hearing. No more anonymous complaints turning into instant violations. Every action the board took had to be public record, posted online and in the community newsletter. No exceptions. And term limits. Lord, we added term limits. 2 years max. No more folks setting up little empires and digging in like ticks. We made sure there was a clear process to recall board members who stepped out of line. I even insisted on a property owner's Bill of Rights. That one got a round of applause at the next meeting. Probably should have added it years ago. The vote to approve the reforms passed unanimously. Even the folks who used to back Karen gave it their blessing. Maybe they'd had enough of the drama. Maybe they just realized they'd been sold a bill of goods. Either way, we finally had something that worked for everybody. Transparency and fairness became the new standard. Every meeting was recorded and live-streamed for those who couldn't make it in person. Budgets were posted where anyone could see where every penny was going. And instead of security patrols, we hired a local service to help keep an eye on things. Professionals, licensed and accountable. I never thought I'd be the one helping run an HOA. But if this whole mess taught me anything, it's that you either show up and do it right, or you let someone else do it wrong. And I wasn't about to let that happen again. The first thing I did was pull up the stakes Karen's crew had pounded into my fields. Some of them were sunk so deep, it took 2 people and a crowbar to wrench them loose. We tossed them into a pile near the old tractor shed, right alongside the fake security cameras and a few broken common area signs. I figured I'd let them sit there a while, as a reminder. Maybe I'd turn them into scrap later, maybe not. It wasn't just about cleaning up the mess, though. This was about restoring something that had been chipped away at for months, maybe years. My family's land had taken its share of hits, hoofprints where they didn't belong, tire ruts cutting through the pasture, broken fencing, trampled seedlings. It looked tired, but it wasn't beyond saving. Word got out I was doing repairs, and folks started showing up without even being asked. Hank brought his backhoe one Saturday morning and cleared out the fallen branches Karen had called debris. Eleanor James came by with 24 saplings from her own garden. Even the Henderson kids pitched in, hauling lumber for the new fence posts we sunk by hand. We rebuilt the old fence line first, sturdy and clean, the way it should be. Then we reseeded the pasture, filling in the scars left by the bulldozers Karen had sent. Took a few weeks, but by the time the grass came in, you could barely tell anything had happened. We cleaned up the barn, repaired the roof, and repainted the trim in the same color my grandfather used, barn red with crisp white edges, the way it always was. At some point, someone suggested we open it up to the public, just on weekends. Maybe let folks walk the trails or bring the kids out to meet the sheep. What started as a casual idea turned into something bigger. We worked with the Historical Society to designate the farm as an official heritage site. They even helped put up a plaque by the main gate, telling folks the story of Carter Land and its place in the town's history. By the end of the summer, the place didn't just feel like home again. It felt like something more, a piece of the town everyone could be proud of. And this time, nobody was putting up any fences to keep people out. I figured once Karen was out and the land was cleaned up, things would quiet down. Maybe we'd all get back to normal, whatever that looked like. But I should have known better. The day Channel 7 aired their segment on the small-town mayor who stood up to HOA tyranny, the phone started ringing. It didn't stop for weeks. At first, it was just local stations, the kind of news anchors who always looked a little too polished, standing in front of my barn with their microphones and carefully rehearsed questions. But then the story jumped. National outlets picked it up. My sister called from 3 states over, laughing as she sent me a photo of my face on her morning news app. Apparently, I'd gone viral. I didn't even know what that meant until Eleanor James explained it to me in line at the bakery. They ran headlines like, "Mayor defends family land from HOA takeover," and "David versus Goliath." How one town took back their rights reporters showed up from networks I'd only ever seen when flipping through channels during lunch breaks. They all wanted to hear how I'd stood up to Karen Whitmore and the HOA. They wanted me to tell them about the bulldozers, the fake security cameras, the forged documents, and I did, more than once. I kept my answers simple. Know your rights, I told them, and don't let anybody push you off your land. Somehow, that plain truth landed harder than I expected. By the second week, emails were pouring in from people all over the country, folks in Florida, California, even Alaska. They had their own HOA nightmares, their own Karens and power-hungry boards, and they wanted to know how we'd done it, how we'd stopped them. Some asked for legal advice, some just wanted to hear the story straight from me. So I wrote everything down, step by step. Hank helped me draft a simple guide on how to challenge an overreaching HOA. We posted it online, and by the end of the month, it had been downloaded a few thousand times. I never planned on becoming a spokesman for HOA reform. But if our mess could help someone else find their backbone, then it was worth it. And if that meant sitting through another awkward interview in front of the barn, I figured I could manage. The fields were quiet again, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones and reminds you why you stuck around in the first place. I sat on the porch swing, watching the sun dip low behind the old oak, the one with my grandfather's initials carved deep into the bark. Gus lay at my feet, snoring softly, his tail giving the occasional lazy thump against the floorboards. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for the sound of engines or the knock of another clipboard-wielding visitor. Things were finally settling. The land had been in my family for generations. It had weathered wars, droughts, recessions, survived everything the world threw at it. And I figured if it could make it through Karen Whitmore's HOA siege, it could make it through just about anything. But the whole ordeal had made me think about what came next, not just for me, but for the town. People had been showing up, asking about the farm's history. School teachers wanted to bring their classes out. A few old-timers suggested we hold events, maybe an autumn festival like the one my grandmother used to organize back in the day. And more than once, someone had asked if we ever thought about making it something permanent. a place people could visit, learn from, a legacy that wasn't just ours anymore. So we made a plan. I got the paperwork started to designate part of the land as a public park. Nothing fancy, just a few acres of open field with walking paths, a couple of picnic tables under the pecan trees, and a spot by the pond where kids could throw bread to the ducks. We talked to the Historical Society about an education center, a small building with old farm tools on display, photographs from the early days, and a space for school groups to sit and hear stories about the people who built this town from the ground up. It felt right, like the land was coming full circle. We weren't giving it up, we were sharing it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of future my grandfather had in mind when he carved his name into that oak tree all those years ago. Something worth passing on, something worth fighting for. Should have known she'd show up one last time. People like Karen don't go quietly. They don't slink away into obscurity, accepting defeat with grace. No, they show up unannounced, dressed in whatever scraps of dignity they've got left, trying to rewrite the ending in their favor. She pulled up in a sleek black SUV, one of those models that looked like it had never seen a dirt road in its life. I was standing by the fence, fixing one of the last posts from her so-called common space stunt, when I saw her step out, wearing a smile as fake as the security cameras she once tried to install. "Mayor Carter," she called, her voice smooth, practiced, like we were about to negotiate a business deal instead of standing on the very land she tried to steal. I didn't bother correcting her, just dusted off my hands and leaned against the fence waiting. She cleared her throat. "I think we got off on the wrong foot." That made me laugh. The wrong foot? That was one way to describe trespassing, forgery, fraud, and nearly getting bulldozers to level my property. But I let her talk. "I wanted to extend an olive branch," she continued. "Maybe discuss a way forward. You and I both know that with the kind of attention this town is getting, there are opportunities." She smiled, waiting for me to take the bait. I didn't. "Opportunities," I echoed. "Like the kind where you walk away clean from everything you pulled?" She exhaled sharply, dropping the act for just a second. "Look, I get it. You won," she said. "But you've got a platform now. You could do a lot with it. Maybe even work with people like me to build something even bigger." I shook my head. "You don't get it, Karen. I didn't fight you to get ahead. I fought you to stop people like you from ever pulling this kind of stunt again." Her jaw tightened, and I could see the last flicker of hope die in her eyes. She opened her mouth to say something else, but I cut her off with a simple nod toward the road. "You should go." She hesitated for a moment, then turned on her heels and climbed back into her SUV. I watched the dust trail behind her as she drove away. And for the first time in months, I knew she wouldn't be coming back. If this whole mess taught me anything, it's that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Knowing your rights is one thing. Having the backbone to defend them is another. Power without integrity crumbles fast, no matter how shiny it looks on the outside. What matters is community, people looking out for each other, and honoring the legacies that built the place we call home. We held Karen accountable because we had to. We built something better because we wanted to. And that's the kind of future worth fighting for. Every single time.